All right. Okay. So welcome everyone to this keynote talk session of the Computing Technologies Milestone Conference. And before I formally introduce Michael Cowling, our professor of the Happy Hub, and I would like to do our acknowledgement of country. So Woman Jeka, welcome. So RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Wiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university and do our research. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges their ancestors and elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So with that, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor Michael Cowling. And Michael is director of our Happy Hub. So the Happy Hub is Hub for Apple Platform Innovation. And so it's a Apple-focused teaching and research space using novel computing platforms to create new learning and research experiences. All right. Michael has been a leader in educational technology for over 20 years, and he has been the recipient for several awards. I think one of them is the Universities Australia 2020 AAUT Award for Teaching Excellence. And he's also the president of I think it's Australasian Society for Computers in Learning in Tertiary Education. And he's also a community fellow as well as the vice president of the Open Access Publishing Association. Well, he's also a fellow of the Australasian Computer Society and the senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy. So there are quite a few titles. And, through his thoughtful use of teaching technology for teaching and for students and educators. And I was chatting to Michael just now before we started. I actually know him before he came to RMIT through the Professor Tech program on YouTube. He was wearing a goggle talking about technology, using technology for education, and his workshop series, weaving technology into the fabric of the classroom, and he presents technologies to teachers and students at schools. Fascinating. Okay, so here, Michael will talk to us about artificial intelligence and his, especially generative AI and its role in research. I think he has written quite a few opinion pieces in several places. I was reading his article in Conversation about AI, and an AI friend, there's very interesting stuff. So we're very fortunate today to hear him talking about, the use of AI for research. Over to you, Michael. So I will stop sharing and give the floor to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jenny, for that kind introduction. It's always funny to sit and listen to somebody introduce you and read through all of those various different things. But thank you. Thank you so much. And indeed, ladies and gentlemen, the AAUT Award for Teaching Excellence, Physical Sciences and Related Studies, which I often tell people is the last time that award was ever handed out because they changed categories afterwards. So I am the last known winner of that particular award, but it's just because they changed the categories, right? I am indeed going to talk to you today about artificial intelligence in research. And as Jenny said, I've been talking about this for, well, basically since November 2022, when ChatGPT came out. James just said in the chat, did they change the awards because of me? Yeah, so clearly, James, no, I don't think so, James. But yeah, I've been talking about artificial intelligence in research for a couple of years. And the reason I've been doing that predominantly is because of my interesting relationship with technology and its impact on education. And as Jenny said, a lot of that is reflected in my past experience. And so the obligatory sort of who are you slide for me is this one here. if I get invited to do a presentation at a conference or whatever it might be, it's usually for one of these two reasons, right? It is either for the award that Jenny mentioned, which is a teaching award. In fact, the director of the AAUT works at RMIT, and Carbone is the director of the AAUT. Or alternatively, I get invited because I'm the president of Ascolite. And good job, Jenny. I give you a round of applause for knowing what Ascolite stood for. Basically, that means you're ready to join the Ascolite executive. If you know that it stands for the Australasian Society for Computers in Learning and Tertiary Education, then you're ready to join our executive society, because it is an awfully long title, and that's why we reduce it to Ascolite. But Ascolite is the preeminent society in Australia for technology enhanced learning. So we're thinking about how technology changes classroom practice in various different ways. And you might have heard people also call this educational technology. And sometimes people talk about it in the context of a discipline. So you might talk about what you're doing in nursing education or engineering education, or in our school, computer science education, right? So those are usually the reasons that I get invited along to one of these things. And I didn't actually put Professor Tech on the slides, although Jenny mentioned him in her introduction. If you go to www.michaelacowling.com, you click on the link to the Create Lab, then you will also find the image of Professor Tech. He's my nom de plume, my superhero identity, and he's the guy that goes puts kids, K-12 students, in VR headsets so that they can, walk the virtual plank and get really excited about computing technologies. But as Jenny said, I am also relatively new to RMIT, and so my other job is as the director of the Hub for Apple Platform Innovation, or HAPI. And this really is an excuse for me to play with a bunch of technology products and Apple technology products, I think, more than anything. But we do have a teaching angle, and we have a research angle and an outreach angle as well. And I guess since I'm talking to people in my school, it would be a good time to sort of mention that we do have a undergraduate minor that is available to any student across RMIT, which is called Design and Develop for Apple Platforms. So if you're interested in sort of pointing students in that direction, let's say you're tutoring a class, then feel free to do that, or feel free to send them in my direction. Or if you're interested in exploring Apple product innovation as well, in like research, for example, or technology enhanced learning, which is my thing, then touch base with me as well. But the reason that I'm talking to you about generative AI is actually, I think, really interesting, which is that my doctorate is actually in artificial intelligence. So if you cast your mind back a long time, and I won't tell you how long, but if you cast your mind back to my doctorate, it was actually in signal processing and neural networks. It was actually in non-speech sound recognition for autonomous surveillance, and building a neural network that could do that effectively. And so my experience is in artificial intelligence, even though my career has been in technology enhanced learning. And so when generative AI really sort of hit the world in November 2022, which is sort of our red letter date, it's when ChatGPT was first released to the world, everybody really wanted to sort of talk about what AI would mean for teaching. That's really where we started. And so that's why people started to ask me. That's why I started to talk about it, because I had this experience in AI. I'm the president of Ascolite, Technology Enhanced Learning. So those two things kind of connected together. And it's not surprising, because I think it's fair to say that when we started talking about generative AI, we were panicked. I think panicked is a fair word. I think if you go back and you read some of those articles that Jenny was talking about from sort of the beginning of 2023, and I'll be honest, some of the stuff that I wrote even in 2023, it was like, what is this going to mean for higher education? Is it going to upend our assessment? Is it going to change the way that we teach in our classroom? And so a lot of that stuff sort of came up, even to the point where initially, early on, people were doing things like getting ChatGPT to write papers for them. as well. And journals actually squish this as a practice pretty quickly. So if you're an RHD student that's listening to this at the moment, there is no need to attribute your work to ChatGPT. You can't make ChatGPT a co-author. Pretty much every journal now does not let that be the case. But early on, you will see here, there's an example on the right-hand side of a paper from Elsevier, Nurse Education and Practice, where they attributed ChatGPT as a co-author. And so people thought ChatGPT was doing enough work, was novel enough in its contribution to this paper, that it should be listed as a co-author. Jenny said, "Is this example real?" I'm pretty sure it's real, Jenny. Go and have a look up the DOI. I think you will find that actually that paper exists, although it may have since been retracted, at least with ChatGPT as the co-author. The other thing people, of course, do, and I guess continue to do, and really is the thing that I'm here to talk to you about, is they use ChatGPT without attributing it, right? So they would actually go and they would ask ChatGPT to write something. And so on the left-hand side, also an Elsevier paper. I'm picking on Elsevier for some reason. In the surfaces and interfaces, we have a paper that got published that actually was clearly written by ChatGPT, because the first sentence says, "Certainly, here is a possible introduction for your topic," which is the first sentence that ChatGPT would say before it spat out those 250 or 300 words for your paper. So, and it's amazing that that actually got published. If you know anything about journal reviewing practices and editorial review and things, it's amazing that it got published, but it did. And again, if you were to look this one up on its DOI, I suspect it's since been retracted or edited in some way. There we go, James found the nursing paper for us. So there's some interesting stuff, right? And that's really what I'm trying to position, is this idea that we were all a bit panicked. And if you go back far enough and you Google me, you'll see that at early days when I was talking about this kind of thing, I mapped this idea to a thing called the Gartner hype cycle. And you can Google the Gartner hype cycle if you'd like. The Gartner hype cycle is a really, really famous way to start mapping innovative technology, and I particularly like it because I love this hump in the middle, right? The hump in the middle suggests that we as individuals often get really excited about a piece of technology. We really think that it's going to change the world, and in our case, upend higher education, upend everything we do in terms of teaching and research, before we've kind of finally realized that that piece of technology is not actually as innovative as we think it is. And so in the Gartner hype cycle, we have 5 stages. We have the technology trigger, which for us was in November 2022. And then when we start, we have this peak of inflated expectations where we all think that the technology is going to change the world. Everything we do is going to change. And the higher education as we know it is going to disappear. And then around about, in our case, around about 12 months from when ChatGPT came out, so around about December 2023, we start to realize that it's not actually going to change everything. And in the case of large language models and ChatGPT, that was because we realized that these models are not very good at telling the truth, that they hallucinate a lot. And if you understand how the models work, that's not surprising. Right? These models, they're basically sort of trying to give you the answer that you most likely want to hear based on this corpus of data that they're accessing out there in the big wide world and the way that they kind of scrape through it, right? And talking about Apple, they just recently delayed their Apple Intelligence rollout. And they said that they did this because they couldn't get Apple Intelligence at the standard that they needed it to be the sort of the core of the new Siri, right? And when I heard that, I thought to myself, it's about hallucinations, isn't it? They were running it, it was able to say things, but it would often get them wrong. Now, they didn't say that, but given the experience that we've had with these tools in other places, I strongly suspect that was the reason why they've delayed this model. And so we sort of, as a community, kind of fell into our trough of disillusionment. But my argument is that we did sort of get through that last year. When I did this mapping, I said that it was by the time we got to June 2024, we were probably going to get through the trough of disillusionment. I actually think that I probably need to adjust this now. I wonder whether we're still in the trough of disillusionment a year later, or at least we're in that trough for a little bit longer than I anticipated back when I did this in mid 2024. But the important thing is that once you get through that trough of disillusionment, you then head on to your slope of enlightenment. And for us, talking about AI in research, that's the bit that I want to highlight, right? Because once the panic has subsided, once we're sort of beyond these tools are going to change everything, and oh my goodness, people are going to write their entire thesis using ChatGPT or whatever it might be, what we actually end up with is an idea of how these models work and what they're good at and what they're not so good at, so that we can actually use them effectively in our teaching and also in our research as well. And when we get to that point, we then end up on this thing called the plateau of productivity. Now, I'll leave you to decide where you think we are on this particular mapping. And when I presented this one last year, I had somebody touch base with me on LinkedIn afterwards and say, Michael, I think we're not as far along as you think we are, which is fine. And this is just Michael sort of sucking my thumb idea of where we are. But I think even if you sort of disagree with some of my dates, hopefully you realize that this is something that if we can work our way through, ultimately as researchers, we can get a feel for what this tool is actually good for. And so what I'm actually going to do now, hopefully having sort of made that case for you, is sort of give you some idea of some of the tools that we use in learning and teaching, and some of the models that have come out over the last 12 months, 18 months, with a view that you might then think about how some of those techniques that we're using in learning and teaching might also apply to your research. And part of the reason that I'm doing that, and in the chat you can disagree with me if you'd like, is because I don't think research is quite as far along as learning and teaching. What I've seen so far with research is that people are still in this very exploratory phase of trying this tool for various things, but I think getting a sense of what it's good for and what it's not so good for in terms of research is still a little bit embryonic, as compared to learning and teaching, where we've spent a bit more time sort of thinking about some of these models. And so as you watch me, you may start to sort of say to me, but Michael, why aren't you talking about Notebook LLM? Why aren't you talking about Claude and what it can do with lit review? And why aren't you talking about the AI features of Covidence or whatever it might be? And we certainly can have a conversation about those things. And if you'd like to touch base with me later, I can give you some more specific examples. I've also talked about that in the past, but it's moving pretty quickly. And so what I wanted to do instead is give you some models that you can start to think about and sort of position in a more general sense what you might use this tool for, and what it's good for and what it's not so good for. Before I get there though, I do want to just very, very briefly clarify what I mean by AI. And I make this point in every presentation where I talk about generative AI, because I think people don't quite understand how the model works. And in doing so, they misunderstand what it can be used for, right? So as I said to you, my doctorate was in classical, traditional AI, right? I was actually doing sort of a forecasting kind of prediction kind of thing, non-speech sound recognition, where you train it with a whole bunch of data and then you give it a test sound and you say, what is this? And it says that's, glass breaking or wood snapping or whatever it is. And up until November 2022, that was by far and away the most popular kind of AI model, right? AI and all of these things that are on the slide, backpropagation neural networks and K-nearest neighbor and all of computational intelligence, and a lot of these things were kind of self-organizing maps. A lot of these things were kind of built on that idea of a traditional model. And what was really important about those particular models is that they would often get things wrong, right? And one of the things we would do as researchers is we would often predict what percentage chance the model had of actually being successful. And that was what we were reporting in our research. It recognizes non-speech sounds correctly 80% of the time, 90% of the time, whatever it might be. But there was a certain level of truth to it, right? You knew when it was right and when it was wrong. With these new models, the generative AI models, large language models, what they're actually doing is they're focusing on using a prompt to generate something. And they've still got that corpus of data. They've still got a whole bunch of data that they scrape from the internet. And there's lots of commentary about whether or not they should have done that or not. You can go out there and you can find that. And then based on that, what they're doing is they're generating some text for you based on a prompt. But they're generating the text based on what they scraped in from the internet. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. And in fact, when you think about it, the model has no mechanism to work out whether that text is true or not, right? What it's really doing is it's giving you persuasive text. It's giving you something that sounds good. It's giving you what you probably want to hear, right? But it has no sense of whether or not that's true or not. So it's not a truth engine. And that's often what I talk about when I talk about generative AI, because I think it's really important to make that point that that it's a persuasion engine. It's not a truth engine. And so if you're expecting it to produce the truth, then you're using it in the wrong way. That doesn't mean that we can't use it effectively. It just means we need to be very conscious of what we actually use it for. And that, of course, is what resulted in the panic, because people get these things that come out of these engines and they sound really good, right? And so people initially, when ChatGPT was generated was used to generate various different texts, they would ask it, generate me a 1,500 word essay on XYZ, and it would produce this awesome essay, and they would read that essay and say, goodness me, my students are going to use this to generate these essays, and we're no longer going to be able to assess them correctly. And so there were lots of concerns in early days about misinformation and plagiarism and academic integrity, how it might undermine assessment strategies, how it might undermine learning as well. And we wrote about it. Like I wrote about it. And again, if you Google me, in one of the last ever issues of Campus Morning Mail, I wrote an article with a couple of my colleagues from Central Queensland University where we said, should we regulate ChatGPT or should we liberate ChatGPT? I wrote it with one of the lawyers, so we used the lawyery sort of terms. And that was indeed something that we were really thinking about a lot. And this is where I think, again, higher education and teaching, the teaching part of what we do as opposed to the research part of what we do, has had some success in pushing forward some of these ideas. And I often point people towards this one and then the subsequent publication as well by Jason Lodge from the University of Queensland and all of his friends. It's not just Jason on his own. There's also some of our colleagues from Deakin University just down the road, and various other places as well, University of Sydney, for example, that talk a little bit about how assessment might be reformed in the age of artificial intelligence. And Jason does some really good work in that article about how to sort of think about this. And as James says in the chat, think about situations where maybe what we're actually doing is not right in the first place, and that's why those assessments are so easily undermined, and what we can do about making changes to those assessments so that it's easier for us to assess the authenticity of our students' learning. And one of the things that Jason has started saying a little bit more often, and actually I was as part of a panel yesterday with Jason, and one of the things that he's been saying a little bit more often is, don't forget that assessment is always just a proxy for learning, right? So what we're not doing is we're not actually reading the assessment because we care about the assessment. What we're actually doing, if we're good educators, is reading the assessment because we want to understand what's happening inside the student's head. Does he understand those concepts? he or she, I should say, do they understand those concepts? And so he often has a diagram where he shows that separation, and he says what's essentially happening is we're no longer able to infer from B that A is taking place, and that's actually what's happening. And I've probably absolutely ballsed up that description for you, but and definitely if you want somebody to describe it to you properly, then Jason Lodge is your man. But I think it's really noteworthy when we're thinking about how assessment might be changed in the age of AI. So this was where we were, right? And as I said to you, I think those issues apply equally for research as they do for teaching, even though I would argue that for research, we are a little bit further behind than we are for teaching in terms of thinking through these kinds of issues. And so one of the things that I often argue at this point is before we kind of get on to talking about how higher education and learning and teaching has started to think through some of these issues, one of the things I kind of argue, or I have to kind of highlight, is this dichotomy, which is eliminate or embrace, right? Because especially again in the early days when people were talking about ChatGPT and they were talking about generative AI, they said, okay, look, ultimately, why don't we just ban it? Why don't we just ban it? Why don't we just stop students from using these particular tools? Why don't we just eliminate their ability to use these tools, and that will solve our problem? And now, of course, as a technologist, as a guy that does technology enhanced learning, I never loved that idea, right? I think if technology is a part of the world, then it should be part of our practice as well. But I understand why people said that, right? I understand why we would talk about eliminating. But the reality is that ultimately it is very difficult to eliminate. As my mum would say, you know, you've left the gate open and the horse is already bolted, right? These students do use this tool, and if you learn to use it effectively, that's very, very difficult for academics to actually spot that you've actually used this tool. And I used to have a slide in here. I think I've taken it out. I have taken it out. I should have left it in. That talked a little bit about the Turnitin AI detection models. And I don't actually know at RMIT whether we use the Turnitin AI detection model, but I know that at my institution back when this all started, we turned on those models in the early days, you know, the one that gives you a percentage, analyzes the student submission and gives you a percentage about how likely it was that it was generated by AI. And then after one semester, we turned it off because it was just so horrendously inconsistent. It would highlight things that were written by human beings as being AI, and it would entirely miss things that were written by AI as being written by AI as well. So at my institution, at least, we turned it off. And if you Google Turnitin and AI, you'll find it at some of those articles from those early days where it very much got it wrong. And so the argument is that we can't eliminate it, right? It's very difficult for us to eliminate the tool. And so instead, really what we need to do is we need to embrace the tool. And if we want to embrace the tool, then we need to have a bit of a think about how we're going to use it. And again, as I said to you, luckily, we've thought about some of these things in regards to learning and teaching. And I think some of these ideas for learning and teaching can translate pretty well across to research as well. So I'm going to talk you through a couple of examples of models that are used in learning and teaching that I think we can very much pick up and start thinking about in terms of our research. And the first one is my favorite, which is the AI assessment scale. And the AI assessment scale is written by Mike Perkins predominantly. Mike and Leon would be your two main guys that you should probably Google. They've written about this a couple of times. Really the seminal sort of theoretical paper about the AI assessment scale is this one, right? This was their first paper in the Journal of University Teaching and Learning Practice, or JUDL for short. And the AI assessment scale breaks down AI and how students might use AI into 5 categories. I think they've now added a 6th category. I think my slide might be a little bit old. But the idea of these 5 categories is that when we're thinking about students in learning and teaching, we can think about them using it for various different things. Number one is we can very much say, well, you can't use any AI, right? And so they recognize that. Maybe we need to just say, in this situation, no AI. Now, I'll talk a little bit later about how we actually do that. But assuming that you want to use AI, they suggest that you can think about AI in various different ways. You can think about AI as a planning tool. You can think about AI as a collaboration tool. You can think about AI as a full AI tool. It can be used for any element of your tasks, or you can think about AI as an exploration tool. I would sometimes say in that instance, really what they're talking about is a brainstorming tool. Now, they do also mention that any time that you do this, you need to evaluate the work that comes out of the AI. And once you understand how the model works, and we just talked about how the model works, that's not surprising, right? You need to be able to read what it says, and you need to understand whether it's telling you the truth. You need to evaluate what it says. And in that context, they're saying if you want to use generative AI to generate the full assessment, you can, right? So they call that full AI. But what I want to highlight for you is more some of the other categories, right? So when we're thinking about this in the context of research, or you as an RHD student, right? And what you're doing as an RHD student, those other things I think are much more likely the places that you're going to use generative AI. You're going to use it for brainstorming. You're going to use it for planning. You're going to use it for collaboration, right? I think they're the places that we can really use this AI effectively, because we don't expect it to tell us all 100% truth, right? And because what we're actually doing is we're engaging in a dialogue with it for the purpose of breaking down an idea, or maybe getting a start in the terms of AI planning, or maybe just working backwards and forwards to polish up a draft, right? And in fact, I wrote a report for one of my committees yesterday. It wasn't at RMIT, don't worry, Jenny. It wasn't at RMIT, but a committee somewhere else, where I essentially wrote the report using ChatGPT. I went to ChatGPT and I said, could you write a report for this month? Here's the minutes. And it wrote the report, and I read the report, and then I went, actually, could you write a little bit more about this? Oh, I don't like this word. Could you delete this sentence? And we went backwards and forwards half a dozen times. And then did you know that it can then drop a Word document when it's finished now? So I just got the Word document. Oh, that's done, right? And away we go. Report writing made easy. So I was collaborating with the generative AI, but importantly, at the end, I analysed the outputs to make sure it hadn't told any mistruths, that I agreed with everything it said, right? So I'm collaborating, but in the end, I'm the final arbiter. And Xiaodong in the comments said, where do you draw the line? That's a really good question, Xiaodong. I think in terms of plagiarism, that's something that we still need to think about. For me, at least in the context of this report, I'm okay with it being written by Gen AI. And in fact, I put a little note at the bottom of the report that Gen AI helped me as well. And I think somebody mentioned that a little bit earlier in the chat. We do that with a lot of conferences these days as well. So I wanted to point this framework out for you, not predominantly because I think you'll use it directly, although if you want to use it directly in your learning and teaching, go ahead. Mike Perkins will be very excited if I tell you to use this framework. It is probably, I think, the best or the #1 framework for learning and teaching, but I also think it's really, really useful in terms of research as well. There are a couple of other examples I want to give you really, really briefly. This one here is modeled by my PhD student. And so I'm predominantly putting it up because I'm proud of him. It's called the AI Teacher Task Spectrum, Teacher Teaching Task Spectrum, AITTTS. Right, and he's actually updated this model, and there'll be a model that comes out in a little while. So keep an eye out. His name's Josiah Coe. You can keep an eye out for that paper that he's publishing pretty much directly as we speak. And Josiah actually just put his thesis in last week. So keep your fingers crossed for him. It's off for examination now. But the reason I'm showing Josiah's model is because I think it's just a really easy way to think about what you might use AI for. He identified very early on, and this was actually pre-generative AI, that it was better at things like procedural and knowledge recall tasks. It was better at application. It was even okay at analytical tasks, but it's not so good at inspirational or creative tasks. And he said it wasn't particularly good at pastoral care tasks either. And you might argue with me there, and I'd be welcome to an argument about it looks creative often. But one of the challenges with generative AI, and Xiaodong in the chat might sort of comment on this as well, is that it's all just remixed. Right? It has no new ideas. It doesn't have the ability to have new ideas, but in remixing other stuff, it sometimes looks like it comes up with new ideas. And so you need to be a little bit conscious of that when you're really asking it to do something truly creative. The other one that he has on this side, which I think he since has moved along a little bit, is pastoral care. And that's because I think what we've identified is that pastoral care, looking after students, is a little bit more nuanced. And Jenny mentioned this. I wrote an article about this in the conversation. If you Google Michael Cowling loneliness or Michael Cowling belonging, then you'll find some of these articles that I've written about this, because we actually did a study. And when we did the study, we identified that whilst this tool is not good at making you feel like you belong, it is actually pretty good at curing short-term loneliness, because it makes you feel good to talk to somebody else, even if that somebody else doesn't actually have any real feelings of their own, right? And so I said to Josiah, look, as we go along, maybe pastoral care actually gets a little bit closer to the center. Maybe it's something that we can actually, we can say AI can be good at in some situations, but that's still sort of an outstanding question. I mentioned Jason Lodge a little bit earlier. He does a lot of work in K-12. And so again, what I'm doing here is I'm kind of pointing out a model for you that is in a slightly different context, with the idea of sort of thinking about how this model might be used in your context. And in this case, this is a model that I think is really good, called the Australian Framework for Generative Artificial Intelligence in Schools. And he gives you this really good set of holistic ideas about how we might think about it. And again, we've kind of already mentioned in the chat things like transparency, making sure that we tell people when we're using this tool, making sure that we're accountable for what it produces. I talked a lot about hallucinations, but there are lots of other things in there as well. So I'm going to point you towards that particular model. And then actually this is the other article for TEXA that I was talking about that Jason that he produced in 2024 about the evolving risk of academic integrity and what that means for AI. And again, even though it's really focused on teaching and learning, as you'd expect, I think it has some interesting insights for us as researchers as well. The other thing that we can do, of course, is we can block things. And I couldn't really talk to you about models for artificial intelligence without thinking about the two-lane approach to assessment, which comes out of the University of Sydney. And the University of Sydney basically said that when we think about assessment, and I think this applies to your research and what you're doing as well, if we're thinking about having mastered skills or knowledge in some way, which Danny Liu, who wrote this two-lane approach to assessment, calls the assessment of learning, then what we should really do is we should have no AI, right? We shouldn't think about generative AI, because ultimately, we don't want the AI to help us, right? It's a bit like saying when somebody does their initial mathematics, we want them to do it in their head instead of with a calculator, right? We're trying to assess, we're doing assessment of learning. And so in this situation, we want to know, have they learnt? And so we don't really want the tool to help us. And then for the lane 2 assessments, if we're interested more in helping students engage responsibly with AI, if we're talking about more authentic assessments, if we're talking about application, well, then we might be in a situation where we use something like Mike Perkins' model to encourage students to actually use AI. And so, of course, you can apply this to your work as well as you're thinking about what you're doing in terms of research, if you're thinking about your lit review, if you're thinking about your research methodology, if it's about initially kind of mastering the skills and mastering the knowledge, don't use AI. If it's about sort of polishing things, if it's about adjusting things, then generative AI might work better for you. And just interestingly, this model's pretty old. This model's been around for a couple of years. Recently, Danny has started saying that Lane 1 assessments need to be invigilated. The only way that we're going to make sure that students are actually not using AI is by actually putting them in a room that is supervised or in some other way invigilating that assessment. And so Danny's model is sometimes argued against because of that reason by various scholars. And in fact, if you look around, you'll find a whole bunch of institutions sort of pushing back against the two-lane model and saying there's more nuance there in the middle. And so one example is the University of Sydney, which came up with this, University of New South Wales, which came up with this model here, which they call the ECOS assessment guidance. It has various different categories: no generative AI use permitted, use of generative AI permitted prior to the development of the final artifact, use of generative AI permitted in completing the whole assessment, and assessments where AI is unlikely to be used, right? And if you look at this and you kind of go, well, that's not that dissimilar to what Mike Perkins said, it's not, right? Once we start to break things up, the categories are fairly kind of similar amongst institutions, but UNSW sort of said we need more nuance. James in the chat has said something similar. He thinks two-lane is too simplistic. RMIT, well, I think we're still working on some of these things, but I think RMIT, we're landing more towards this kind of model as opposed to Danny's two-lane model. I often argue for Danny's two-lane model, but I'm biased because I like Danny Liu's one of my friends, and so I tend to sell his model more. So that gives you a couple of ideas, right? And really, again, I know if you wanted, if you're hoping that I give you some really specific examples, then I'm happy to do that. We can do that outside of the context of this presentation. But given that this was a keynote, I thought let me give you some more holistic ideas, ways to think about how you might use this generative AI and some various different models. And that doesn't mean that we're not thinking about the other stuff, right? Usually at this point, somebody sticks up their hand and says to me, but what about the other stuff? What about using ChatGPT and whether or not it's cheating? Is using ChatGPT cheating? We need to decide, is using ChatGPT cheating or not? What about us using it as academics in our work? Is that okay? What about if we're using it specifically to mark students' assessment? Is that okay? Well, now that you understand a bit about how the model works, you might be able to answer that for me. How's it going to affect our overarching curriculum in various areas? ICT, which is what we're talking about, but even HAS or science or technologies, right? And then, of course, the one that's not on these slides is what about the ethics, right? What about this situation where some students are using it, some other students aren't using it, but we're marking all of our assignments assuming that students are using generative AI? That's probably not a good thing. And Dana in our school, for example, probably would be very interested in talking to you a little bit more about that, the AD for ITI. The answer to all of those questions is we haven't worked it out, right? Whilst we were too busy panicking about AI and assessment and AI and teaching and learning, we didn't spend as much time thinking about it for research. We're really just starting to think about it now, I think, and we certainly haven't thought about it very much in terms of some of these other ideas as well. So if you're sitting here as a researcher and you're early in your candidature, maybe these are some of the things you might want to think about as you sort of progress on as a PhD student and then eventually a scholar as well. Maybe they fit in for you. I've got one more idea for you before we finish, and that is that ultimately, if you want to use AI, I think a really good model that we can use to think about artificial intelligence is this model, which I use all of the time for my research, which is the design-based research model. Now you might be looking at this and going, but Michael, why are we using DBR? Why does DBR make sense for this particular task? And the answer is the design-based research, or the colliery, which is design-based thinking, is really, really good because it encourages us to brainstorm. and it encourages us to design and think, and then importantly, it encourages us to evaluate at the end. So whilst I'm not actually suggesting that you use DVR as your mechanism to build, to work with ChatGPT or these other generative AI tools, the individual bits involved in thinking about what am I going to ask the AI in terms of design, what is it going to give me, and what does that actually mean in terms of evaluation, can be useful, right? As well as the kind of the iterative process of going around and around. And I told you the example of me sort of having a conversation with it to generate my report yesterday, right? So that iteration can be really, really useful as well. Essentially what we're saying is that as students, we can develop prompts for investigating, we can develop prompts for designing and producing, but don't expect your AI to evaluate. ChatGPT is not very good at it, but our students are. And work out how you can work with AI and AI creativity tools and not against them as well. So you're sitting there and you're an RHD student, and hopefully I've given you some stuff to think about. I'm more than happy for you to shoot me an email, and we can talk about some of these ideas more as well. But I did want to mention, because I'm a bit of a shill for the University of Sydney, apparently, that if you are an academic sitting there in the audience and you're going, oh, this is really, really interesting, can you be more specific, Michael? What's a specific tool? I'm going to recommend one to you, and that's Cogniti. And Cogniti is developed by the University of Sydney, developed by Danny Liu. It is an AI agent that is really, really good at giving students feedback, at working with various different assignments and various other things to help us as academics, again, predominantly in our learning and teaching. If you talk to Danny, he will tell you that it's used by thousands of different institutions these days. It's won several awards, including the AFR Innovation Award and various other things. And it is a really, really useful tool. And so there's the website down the bottom, but if you Google Cogniti, then you will find lots of examples of Cogniti. So that's my bonus tip. My bonus tip, if you're an academic in the audience going, but I want a tool to use, have a look and see if you can, if Cogniti maybe suits you. Hopefully that's been interesting for you. Hopefully that's been helpful for you in various different ways. If you've listened to me talk and you do want a little bit more from me about some of the specifics of generative AI, I've got a couple of different places that I can point you towards. Number one, probably my favorite place to point you towards is my presentation for the New South Wales Higher Education Summit. The link's down there at the bottom, but as well as that, if you Google New South Wales Higher Education Summit Michael Cowling, you'll find it as well. This was a great presentation. I did a presentation, Tim Fawns from Monash did a presentation, and also Danny and Kelly Matthews and some other people were on a panel as well during that day. And one of the fun things is that we used a lot of metaphor during that day. So when you watch that video, you'll see us absolutely killing all of the metaphors, right? And Tim's metaphors were great. If you want something a bit more practical, then we've been running a symposium for the last couple of years at the University of Sydney. We ran one in 2024. We ran one again in 2025. And these are discipline-specific examples of how people have used these tools in their area. A lot of it is, again, teaching related, but you might find that in your particular area, you can find something where somebody's got some examples of how they've used that particular tool for nursing or paramedics or allied health, or in our case, we're SCT. So there are some examples of computer science as well. Finally, I'll point you towards these ones. These are the postcards of practice at the University of New South Wales. I worked with the staff at UNSW on these as well. And there are about 12 of these at the moment that, again, give you some specific examples of practice in various different disciplines of using generative AI, predominantly for assessment and feedback, but again, might give you some really, really interesting ideas on how we might use these tools. And when we made these, we very much tried to make them, just double-sided, right? A quick and easy way for you to understand what somebody's doing with it. In this case, the one on the slide is Jenny. She's a psychologist, and so she was using it for psychology. So again, trying to just spark some ideas for you. Okay, that's about it for me. Hopefully, I've kind of helped you think about various different things. If you want to reach out to me, as I've said to you, oh, look at that, I've got the wrong email address on there. You can touch base with me on X, although I don't use it very often these days. I'm more likely for you to get a hold of me on Facebook. So there's my Facebook link, or LinkedIn as well. I'm on LinkedIn all the time. Or yes, m.cowling@cku.edu still works. I'm an adjunct professor there, but as well as that, michael.cowling@rmit.edu.au as well. And if you want to see what Professor Tech looks like, then you can go to the createlab.com.au, and on the front page of that website you will find a picture of Professor Tech, or if you go to michaelacowling.com, you'll find a whole bunch of links to various different things that I do, including the weaving technology into the fabric of the classroom workshop that Jenny mentioned in the intro, as well as some of the other outreach activities I do as well. That's it. I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, so much for your time. I'm happy to field any questions if there are any. Otherwise, I'll let you get back to a massively busy day for your milestone reviews. Thanks, Jenny.